On today's Visual Studio Toolbox, we'll take a look at some extensions you should consider installing to make yourself more productive when using Visual Studio Code. Hi, welcome to Visual Studio Toolbox. I'm your host, Robert Green, and today we're going to talk about Visual Studio Code. And joining me to do that is Philip Elder. Hey, Philip, how are you?
I'm doing all right. How are you doing?
I'm great. Welcome to the show.
Thank
So,
you.
before we begin, introduce yourself to our viewers.
Okay, I am a technology specialist out of St. Albert, Alberta, Canada. Been doing this for 25 to 30 years now. I've been a Microsoft Most Valued Professional since 2009, originally on Small Business Server, now as a high availability MVP. So my primary modus operandi is Senior Technical Architect. We do business to business, and my primary focus is on premises. So providing on premises high availability solutions.
Awesome.
Mhm.
So the show is, of course, Visual Studio Toolbox, and we spend most of our time focusing on Visual Studio. But
Mhm.
I would say that in the Visual Studio Toolbox is Visual Studio Code. And I know that I use both. I use Visual Studio. I do most of my development in Visual Studio, but I certainly use Visual Studio Code often. And you offered to show us today, and I thought was a really good idea, was how you set up Visual Studio Code, what extensions you install, and what advice you would have for someone who's either starting to use Visual Studio Code, a Visual Studio developer now starting to use Visual Studio Code, or even just somebody new to coding and Visual Studio Code is their tool of choice. So
Okay.
with that, what do you got?
Yeah. I, I spent a significant amount of time listening to a fellow friend and MVP, Ben Thomas, tell me that I needed to get VS Code because I'd done all of my PowerShell basically in OneNote and Notepad.
Mm,
And it was getting to the point where it was unbearable or unmanageable. So I took the plunge and went and installed it, and worked it out. And the primary thing for me is color coding. I'm dyslexic, so I reverse things very easily, and that's just part of it. But the color coding helps me to see the code the way it's supposed to be. So for anybody who struggles with lines and lines and lines of text and not being able to see it quite right, this is definitely the way to go about it. And I'm sure there's modules available for other aspects of code. So my primary language of choice is PowerShell. So it's basically scripting. And from there, I run Visual Studio Code as portable. So it's sitting in a folder on OneDrive Consumer. So it goes across all the machines, Surface, whatever I use to do the coding that needs to be done. Then on top of that, the Git repository is installed and configured to hook in from there as well. So I end up with having everything nice and contained. I can get it from pretty much anywhere. It's in our remote desktop services remote app. So what you're seeing is actually a remote app, and it's available to me pretty much anywhere on any machine.
cool.
So the first thing I do is I get the portable mode set up. There's a few lines that need to be done with the INI files and JSON files, if I remember correctly. Install Git, get Git configured, get the repository folder, the workplace folder set up, and then from there I'll install the extensions. So I like this one. This is one of my favorites. Better comments. It allows me to use different codes. So in this case, exclamation, question mark, or the word to do, or anything. It doesn't matter what it is. And I can set it to whatever color I want it to be relative to the work that I'm doing. So I have stages in what I'm doing. I have completion steps and all of that, or milestones, sorry. And each character is color coded according to that. It really helps to keep a handle on the way things are progressing in what I'm doing in the code.
And then you can configure that by what? Clicking on that settings icon or something?
Yeah, it's in the JSON file. So I'm able to somewhere in here. So let's don't you dare change on me. So that's the hex code for the color, the
Oh,
character.
cool. So then you just apply the tag and it applies the color.
That's correct.
Oh, that
And
is
then I can
cool.
add as many different character sets. And the
Mm-hmm.
key is in the code, the PowerShell code, there's the hash, the pound sign, a space,
Mm-hmm.
and then one of these characters, whatever the character set is, and it'll drop the color in there.
Oh, that's really neat.
So if I go back to here, we can see, so I got the hashtag question mark turns
Mm-hmm.
blue, pound sign turns bright green,
Nice. Okay.
exclamation mark turns bright red, and so on. To do, that's my orange is, this is what I have to do as part of my step routine of going
Okay.
through and making the changes. So that's
Cool.
the first thing. So that's definitely a big thing for me. Git history is important because if I make changes and I do something up, I can go back through the history. It's kind of like undo versioning in SharePoint and SharePoint Online.
And so where would you see that the Git history once you install
Oh
that?
dear, that is, I don't use it often, so we're pushing the memory here. It is the little guy. Where is he? Let's close that.
Is it the one to the left, the time clock?
Uh, hmm,
Git
yes,
view file history.
yeah, there it is.
Okay, cool.
So if there was any history to the file itself, it would be showing me that.
Okay, sweet.
So in the case of our template files, there will be 5, 6, 8, 10, whatever versions of that particular file. So I'm able to see the progression from start to where we're at and step back through that.
Okay.
And of course,
Cool.
PowerShell, really simple. So I can get WMI and it just throws up all of the possible PowerShell code,
Oh, nice. Okay.
PowerShell steps. It's not necessarily complete because we do a lot of work in Exchange. We do a fair amount of work in SQL, and it's not complete necessarily for those components, but for the basic PowerShell steps,
Awesome.
cluster storage management, and all of that, it's all in there. So that's
Excellent.
really helpful if I'm trying to figure out what command I need next.
Mm-hmm.
That is very helpful.
Cool.
And the registry, we do a fair amount of work with end users. So the registry is something that we'd sometimes be using. I don't use it very often anymore. Let's see if I can close that, close that. I'm not going to mess with that for the moment. So I haven't used this one in quite a long time, but there are where the files are located is in the client folders, so it's not something I'm very comfortable with showing publicly.
That's fine.
As far as how it works, it highlights everything. It tells me what I need. So if I need to make an update or a change to a registry file before sending it off and importing it, that's what this guy's all about.
Cool.
And then this was for a particular project, so I'm able to bind to a SQL database. That was a one-off kind of situation. Most of the database work that I do now is in SQL Studio,
Mm-hmm.
and it's on the SQL Server itself. So this was a particular edit process on the tables and some tweaking that needed to be done. And that's these three guys here.
So what does the SQL Server one do? What does
It's
it
part of the,
gain you?
it gives me the ability to connect into SQL directly.
Oh, okay.
So
And then
between the
gives
three
you
of
the
them,
ability to write scripts, and so you don't necessarily have to pop over into SQL Server Studio,
that's right.
SQL Server Management Studio to be exact.
Yeah.
Get the context switch, so you can do that from inside Visual Studio Code.
Yeah, it gets everything in VS Code. It makes it that much easier when it comes to working with a database setup or a
That's
SQL
actually
setup.
pretty cool because if you're just testing, and you want to just make changes to data, I do some testing. You change some records, some rows, then you want to go back and reset them. So now you got to pop back over to Management Studio, then pop back over to Visual Studio Code, popping back and forth. So this gives you the ability to just do it all in one place.
Yep.
That's
and
cool.
If I'm going to break it, I'm going to break it, and I can fix it.
Right.
And then the final one that goes in is Visual Studio icons. So we go back into here, and let's scroll up. So it gives some context to the folder icons themselves. So Linux, it's got the nice little penguin on there. If there's SQL, it'll have SQL Server. RDS, it'll have RDS server roles. So remote desktop services, it'll PowerShell gives me the PowerShell icon on the file name. So it makes it a little bit easier to identify. So it's a neat little, it's a handy little guy.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much it. So from there, I'm not sure how to close this other window here. We're doing things that, there we go. We're doing things that I'm not necessarily always in the process of doing.
Mm-hmm.
So this is pretty much it. It's an amazing platform. It took me probably about 4 months to get comfortable with it and start transferring all of my Notepad, OneNote content into the workplace that I've set up for this for all of the code. But since using it for the last, I don't know how many years now, it's probably, I think about 5 or 6 years, it's really made a big difference. My code integrity is fantastic. I'm consistent. It's very difficult for me to make errors as a result, because A, the code is there. The suggestions are there. B, C, the color codes are there for me, so I can actually see what I'm writing or reading. And all in all, it's awesome. It's absolutely phenomenal. It's a great tool.
Great. Cool. That's awesome. There's definitely going to add a couple of those extensions myself. That's awesome. Cool. All right. Well, thanks so much for coming on and showing us those.
You're welcome.
Very, very useful.
Thank you.
And hope you guys enjoyed that. And we'll see you next time on Visual Studio Toolbox.